For those of you who are used to working with spreadsheet software, you'll be used to working with cells and maybe also some built-in functions provided by spreadsheet software like Google Sheets or Excel. So when we're working with cells, we might store data in them, maybe just like some numbers. You could think about each cell as representing some kind of variable. And when we talk about variables, if you think back to your algebra days, the meaning of a variable is that its value can change over time. So what we mean by this is if we store the number 10 in cell C4, we can always change that number later, for example, to 100. And if we want to reference that value, we could reference the value by its variable name, which in the case of spreadsheets is some kind of axis corresponding to the row and column. So if we wanted to reference this variable in spreadsheet software, we might be dealing with a reference to something like C4 as our variable name. So our variable names in spreadsheet software are a little more rigid. They're related to rows and columns. So if we later wanted to reference this variable in spreadsheet software, we just say like equals C4. And now as the value of this variable changes, our reference to it changes as well. So this is the concept of variables. We'll store some value in some place, either in spreadsheet software in a cell or in Python in our own named variable. And we'll do this in a sec. And then we can always reference that variable instead of the value. And the nice thing about doing that is that when we change the value, any dynamic references to it will also be updated. So variables, the value can change over time. I see some folks falling asleep like, yeah, we know variables, so let's keep it moving a little bit. Also in spreadsheet software, we have access to built-in functions that are provided to us. And as long as we know about their existence and maybe read up about how to use them, we can use them. So I asked you an onboarding survey question of like, well, what's your favorite built-in function in spreadsheet software? And so a lot of you mentioned various functions. I'd like to volunteer right now to let us know about a function you may use commonly in spreadsheet software. We'll use it as an example of a built-in function. So any takers, built-in function? Yeah, what's that? Sum. I love that. That's perfect. So there has to be some kind of awareness on our part that this sum function exists. Maybe we've used it before, we've seen some reference to it, or we could see that it exists in a list of provided functions. If we want to use the sum function in Excel, we could always sum up a bunch of numbers like equals sum. So that's how we would get started, by invoking one of these built-in functions. How do we finish invoking or calling this function? Any thoughts? There's some syntax in spreadsheet software we need to make this work. Yeah, in the back. Parentheses, exactly. These functions are defined somewhere. In order to actually use it or call it or invoke it, we need trailing parentheses. So if we actually want to perform some kind of sum, we also need trailing parentheses. Now, what do we put in these parentheses? Yeah, there's some kind of arguments or inputs that we must now pass into this function. But which arguments or parameters do we pass in what order? That's totally determined by which function we're using. When we use the sum function, we might pass in certain parameters to it and it will like those. But if we use an if statement, the parameters will be different. And the parameters that we pass into any given function are determined by that function's definition. And in spreadsheet, we get a little hint about what those parameters or input arguments should be. So if we want to sum these numbers in spreadsheet software, we can pass in what would essentially be a list of numbers as our parameter. And now we also need to close these parentheses. And that's what it means for us to invoke or use a built-in function. So first we have to figure out, well, what functions are available to us? Second, for each function, what parameters or input arguments does it want specifically? And then we provide those. Sometimes we might provide comma separated parameters inside the parentheses. And so that's what it's like to invoke a built-in function in spreadsheet software. Before we move on to Python, let's do an example of an if statement in spreadsheet software. Later, we'll transition into doing the equivalent in Python. So if we wanted to do an if statement in spreadsheet software, it involves the if function, which takes a few arguments. First argument or parameter is something called the logical expression. It will either evaluate to true or false, and depending on what its value is, we'll have some options to return either way. So for example, if cell C4 is greater than 10, now we use a comma to separate each parameter that we're passing into the function. And so the if function in spreadsheet wants now what to return if that condition is true. So we'll say like, yep, now comma, now we're going to specify something to output if that condition is not true, like maybe like nope. And now finally we close these parentheses. And so it's true that this value is over 10, so we see yep. But if we change this value later to like 8, now we see nope. So conditionally, based on whether our conditional logical statement was, our expression was met or not, we see something happen either way. More about if statements in a few minutes. I don't think I explained that fully, but a lot of you are already familiar with spreadsheets and you know how to do this. So just a quick recap there. So hopefully these concepts are familiar to many of you, but now let's see how to do these in Python.